joint venture as one of the innovative property investment financing model. Remember, we are looking into specifically our target market or audience being the investor buyers and distressed sellers. So I think by now our circle is quite aware of who is our main audience. So I thought that it's fair enough that in joint venture agreements, certain things are about to go otherwise. So hence, this afternoon, I'll appreciate that you take us through from one of the YouTube content you did during the course of the week as to why is it important for property investors to have solid rules in joint venture agreements. Over to you. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Ntabiseng. So when we speak about joint ventures in the South African framework, we are speaking about a variety of different legal consequences and agreements that could actually exist. The joint venture in itself is nothing more than a commercial term to explain the relationship between two or more parties and their common goal. And more often than not, you'd find joint ventures in the construction space, quite a few of them, in the tender space, in a number of different tenders where different service providers collaborate in a joint venture in order to acquire the tender, perform in terms of it, and basically complete an outcome of a particular job. So all a joint venture means is that there's a common goal, a common interest between multiple parties, and that this interest, the relationship between them, is going to complete, or the outcome is the completion of this interest. So that's the commercial sense. And it's good that people just understand that commercial sense, because in every business person's mind, in every property investor's mind, it's the commercial sense that's important to them. Now, in the legal sense, even though the legal complexities aren't that crucial for investors or business people to understand, certain fundamentals have to come to mind. Otherwise, property investors, business people will find themselves in hot water when something actually goes wrong. Now, to incorporate, or let's say to formalize a joint venture, the first thing that needs to be asked is, well, what is the nature of the relationship between the parties? How long do these parties intend to work together? What sort of contributions are going to be expected from the parties to this joint venture? What sort of profit shares or distributions are going to be expected by the parties to this joint venture? Are there any specific rules on how the joint venture is intended to be carried out? So things like that involve, for example, the making of decisions, and small decisions as well as big decisions. How does the day-to-day operation function versus how does the long-term strategic planning and implementation function? So all these things are crucial, right? And now anyone that's been in the business space will start looking at me and going, but hold on, this sounds very much like the questions that a person would typically ask when trying to deal with a company and shares. Exactly, all right? A company and shares has just been a formal way that our government, as well as across the world, has formalized this collaboration between persons in order to have shares in a company that achieves certain outcomes and that has rules regarding control and things like that. But a company is not the only way of doing it. So a joint venture can be done in multiple ways. So one such way, as an example, is simply a contract. There could just be a contract between you and myself where we decide that we're going to buy a property and we're going to jointly own it. And it's in my personal name, it's in your personal name. We basically have a 50% undivided share of the property. And that's possible. It's not a good idea, but it's possible. And this sometimes is where business people go wrong, is they don't realize the consequences of their conduct. And so another example. Sorry, yeah.
Can I just come in there?
Sure.
As you go ahead? in the sense where you explain the 50-50 shares, is it a standard condition that in joint venture, irregardless of how much each party has contributed, but we're bound to go into equal shares?
No.
Or it depends on how much each party has contributed? Because I can just imagine, let's say, for instance, myself and you, we go on joint venture and you are putting in 70% to the deal. I'm putting in 30% of what is required. I cannot expect to get 50% return as you, whereas I only brought 30%. Am I correct?
So no, remember that a joint venture is an agreement. And whether you do it in a company, whether you do it in a contract, whether you do it in the form of a partnership, which I'll explain later is a bit dangerous, the terms of the agreement will dictate how the joint venture works. So many agreements people have entered into where a person contributes capital, sometimes 100% of the capital, but they only receive 50% of the shares because the other party, for example, might be contributing some intellectual property, know-how, trade secrets, industry expertise, whatever the case is. Both parties have to be comfortable that the other one is pulling their weight, right? And that's there is no rule. It could be 90-10. It could be 80-20. There is no rule as to share. It's a commercial relationship. So commercially, the commercial terms need to make sense. I'm not going to contribute 10 million rand to someone who is doing their first property deal, as an example. And I've got no idea if this person actually has the knowledge or know-how on how to do this. And I'm giving them 10 million rand without asking any questions and taking a small shareholding. Yet, if I invest in someone that has a lot of know-how, and this person's been making money for the last 20 years, doing the same thing over and over, and they ask for a huge amount of capital outlay in return for 20%. But I know that 20% is going to pay for itself. Of course, I'd invest. It's really just a commercial decision. It has nothing to do with set rules that come into play. That's why understanding the legal nature and framework is so important, because questions like that normally come up, and the lines between commercial sense and legal sense are sometimes blurred. So how the negotiation takes place can be anything applies, but what you land up with has to have a legal nature and framework to it. And that's why I use the example of a company, of just a simple contract between two people, or a partnership between persons, because each one of these would have different consequences on how the relationship is governed, how easily it's governed, etc.
Oh, perfect. Thank you for clearing that out. Bruno, from your experience with joint venture agreements, would you say that it's advisable to go through a joint venture agreement as a company or as individuals, whereby we buy property goes into a joint venture agreement with Bruno Simão Law, or would it rather be Tabi and Bruno?
Sure.
And what are the tax implications and benefits thereof as we wrap up?
Sure, absolutely. So there's two different layers to this that we need to remember. The first layer to your question. So your question is, what is the ideal legal entity for a joint venture? And as I explained earlier, we are looking at different options, and the most common options is simply contractual relationship, an actual partnership, or a company, as an example. So let's look at those as the main ones. Now, the best legal format or the best legal framework functions in two different levels. So you have to first look at the JV level, and this is the level that's actually performing the operations. And then you look at the shareholder, call it a shareholder or owner or member or partner or a contracting party, whatever you want to call it, which are the people that are involved in collaborating in this joint venture. And so your question was, what should the joint venture look like? But then you also asked, how should we enter into the joint venture? Should it be Intabi and Bruno, or should it be a company and a company? Now, at the bottom level, let's first deal with the bottom level. How you perform or execute a joint venture depends, number one, on what outcomes you're trying to achieve. So if you look, for example, at a lot of government work and even private sector, but where the tenders get put out, a lot of them want to deal with a company to begin with. So you'd rather have a joint venture in a company. The only risk that you'd have in those circumstances is if it's a new company and doesn't have a track record, you might not be considered. But ideally, they'd want a company, they'd want VAT registrations and the like. So you'd want to be in a company. Companies also, for the execution of a joint venture, are really nifty because we have a Companies Act that already prescribes much of the rules relating to operation of companies and shareholding and shareholders' rights and minority shareholders and oppressed shareholders, and there's case law supporting it. So by entering a joint venture in the corporate space, you've got years and years of support and legislation and knowledge. Whereas if you enter a joint venture in the partnership space, there is quite a bit. Partnerships have become less and less popular, but partnerships carry certain risks to them, especially where the partners could be liable in their personal capacity for partnership debts. And then contracts are basically creating a joint venture from scratch because there is no template, there is no joint venture act, there is no case law that prescribes certain the minimum requirements. So when you enter into a contract with you and I, we'd have to ask every question to say, but when do we do this? What decisions are made? How do we make these decisions? What's included? What's excluded? How do we change the nature of the arrangement? So much needs to be asked when entering into a contract that it becomes very cumbersome. So at this bottom layer, I normally suggest people start a company. The admin's not difficult. It's not necessarily costly. And at least there's a great support infrastructure around it. Now, what vehicles do you use to enter into the joint venture? Now, that is dependent on each individual. So some individuals use trusts because remember, it's just a holding vehicle for the shares in a joint venture as an example. So it could be your company, it could be you in your personal name, it could very well be your trust. That isn't so much the concern. That is a question, and then we're going to go back to those previous conversations that we had around structuring to say, what should your estate planning look like? Do you have a trust? Because it's not to say that everyone should use a trust to hold shares in a joint venture. No. Right? If it's your only joint venture and it's one joint venture, maybe do it in your personal name or do it in another company. But if you've got great estate planning protocols in place, then use the trust because the trust is there intentionally to be able to hold shares. But like me, for example, I use a holding company that's held by a trust because I find benefit in allowing dividends to be declared from this joint venture up to a holding company exempt from dividends tax, and leaving it in that holding company and utilizing it for other businesses. So I've got my structure, which I enjoy using. And other individuals, if it's a small little joint venture, typically not in the property space, and they just want to give it a shot, and maybe it's a quick joint venture where it's work in, money out, and they've got a very low tax rate. Why not? Why not do it in their personal name? At the end of the day, they get the cash and they go utilize the cash immediately. Maybe they get paid out as salaries for running the joint venture, so they don't even need to worry about receiving it as shareholders. So where they hold the shares is irrelevant because the company has a finite period of operation. And their estate planning is not all that crucial. So I've seen people do it in their personal names.
Wow, perfect. Thank you so much, Bruno. You've summed up everything in detail. Dear Cycle, ladies and gentlemen, you've heard from one of the best property attorney, Bruno Simão, from Bruno Simão Law, what to do rather and what to expect when you enter into a joint venture agreement, just to make sure that the marriage, I'll call it the marriage, goes smoothly from the beginning until the end. Make sure that you look into all the loopholes, and unfortunately, because you are not an expertise into such, you are bound to consult with Bruno to ask for advice. I always advocate that before you sign anything, before you sign that OTP, regardless of what financing model you are using, just make sure that you consult with our office or Bruno's office so that you get the best legal advice and to make sure that your buying process is as smooth as ABC. Thank you so much, Bruno. I know you've got a very hectic schedule, and wishing you all the best for the entire evening. Awesome. Thank you, dear Cycle. Let's meet next week. Same time, same place. Thank you. Have a lovely evening.
Thanks, Ntabi.
Thank you, Bruno.